An unexpected encounter at the airport changes everything for Jack, a man on the brink of a breakdown. When he notices a lost and frightened boy, he decides to help, but soon realizes the situation is more complicated than it seems. As they search for the boy's mother, secrets begin to surface, pulling Jack into something he never anticipated. Will he be able to do the right thing?
Jack sat slumped on a hard plastic chair in the bustling airport terminal, struggling to catch his breath. His heart pounded in his chest as if trying to escape, his shirt damp with sweat. Around him, travelers passed by, their faces flickering with curiosity or thinly veiled judgment. He could see a few casting sidelong glances, and he knew what they were thinking, a grown man falling apart in public, a spectacle for all to see. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he didn't dare pull it out. It was probably his boss, asking why he had missed the last 2 meetings, or maybe his ex-wife, reminding him about some forgotten obligation. Just the thought of it made his head spin even faster, the walls of the airport seeming to close in on him. Amidst the blur, a sudden movement caught his eye. A small boy, about 7 or 8 years old, stood a few feet away, struggling with a small blue suitcase that kept tipping over. He wore a red hoodie and jeans, his face a mix of determination and something else, fear. The boy's eyes darted around the terminal, searching for someone. Jack stared at the boy, his anxiety momentarily shifting to curiosity. The child looked lost, out of place, like a misplaced luggage tag waiting to be claimed. Before he even realized what he was doing, Jack found himself rising from his chair. It was something to distract him from the chaos inside his head, at least for a moment. "Hey, buddy," Jack called out, his voice still shaky. "You okay? You looking for someone?" The boy looked up, his brown eyes wide and filled with uncertainty. I can't find my mom," he stammered. "She was supposed to be right there, but His voice trailed off as his lip began to tremble. Jack swallowed hard, glancing around as if expecting a frantic mother to appear at any moment. But no one came rushing over. He crouched down to the boy's level, trying to muster some composure. "What's your name, kid?" "Peter," the boy answered, clutching the handle of his suitcase with white-knuckled fingers. "Okay, Peter. I'm Jack," he said, forcing a small, reassuring smile. "Where did you last see your mom?" Peter pointed vaguely toward the security checkpoint. "Over there, but I lost her when everyone was rushing through." He bit his lip, trying to hold back tears. "I don't know where she went." Jack hesitated. This wasn't his problem, really. He could just walk away, find a staff member to deal with it. But then again, he didn't know what he would do if he left Peter there, feeling just as lost himself. The boy's frightened eyes mirrored something in Jack's own heart, something he'd rather not confront. "All right," Jack sighed, more to himself than to Peter. "Let's find her then." He reached out and gently took the boy's hand. "We'll start near the security area. Maybe she's still looking for you there." Peter nodded, his grip on Jack's hand tightening. Together, they walked toward the security checkpoint, weaving through the sea of travelers. Jack's mind raced, thoughts of his own troubles ebbing just enough to let in a small flicker of purpose. As they passed the baggage claim, Jack couldn't help but glance at the rotating belt of suitcases, each belonging to someone going somewhere, each one with a destination, a place to belong. He wondered if he still had one of those. They reached the edge of the security area, and Jack scanned the crowds. No frantic mother, no signs, nothing. Jack's pulse quickened again, and not because of his anxiety this time. He glanced down at Peter, who was peering nervously at the crowds. Jack squeezed his hand. "We'll find her, Peter. Don't worry." But as they moved forward, Jack couldn't shake the sinking feeling in his chest. Maybe Peter wasn't the only one who was lost after all. Jack and Peter navigated the chaos of the airport, weaving through the stream of passengers who moved with purpose, each seemingly sure of where they needed to be. Jack envied them. He glanced down at Peter, who clutched his small suitcase like a lifeline. The boy's wide eyes scanned the crowd, looking for a familiar face. But with every passing minute, it seemed like hope was slipping further away. "Do you remember what your mom was wearing?" Jack asked as they reached the area near the security checkpoint. Peter nodded slowly, scrunching his face in concentration. "A green coat," he said. "And she had a big brown bag. She always carries it." Jack's gaze swept the crowds, searching for anyone in a green coat. There were plenty of people rushing by, but none matched Peter's description. He cursed under his breath, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He hadn't planned to spend his day looking for a lost kid's mother, but now that he was here, he couldn't bring himself to leave the boy alone. They approached a security officer standing near the entrance. "Excuse me," Jack said, forcing himself to speak clearly. "This boy is looking for his mother." He lost her somewhere around here. The officer's expression softened as he looked at Peter. What's your mom's name, son? Emma, Peter answered quietly. The officer picked up a walkie-talkie and relayed the information, then turned back to Jack and Peter. We'll make an announcement over the PA system. You two should wait here for a few minutes, see if she shows up. Jack nodded, leading Peter over to a nearby bench. They sat down, Peter swinging his legs nervously. Jack tried to offer some comfort. Hey, don't worry. She's probably on her way back here right now. But even as he said it, Jack couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. If the boy's mother was really looking for him, she would have come here first, right? His eyes darted around the terminal, searching for any sign of a frantic woman in a green coat. Instead, he saw only the hurried faces of travelers and the distant figures of families reuniting, none of them matching Peter's description. Minutes ticked by, and when the announcement finally came over the loudspeaker, Jack could see Peter perk up with a flash of hope. But as they waited, no one came running. No mother appeared from the crowd. Jack watched the boy's shoulders slump with disappointment, and something inside him tightened. Maybe we should try somewhere else, Jack suggested after a while, hoping to keep Peter from breaking down. Let's check the baggage claim area. She might be there looking for you. Peter didn't resist. He just nodded and slid off the bench, picking up his suitcase. They walked in silence, the only sound between them the soft rolling of the suitcase wheels on the tiled floor. As they made their way toward the baggage claim, Jack's mind raced through all the possibilities. Maybe the mother had gone to another part of the airport, or maybe there had been a misunderstanding. Whatever the case, this was turning out to be a lot more complicated than he had anticipated. They reached the baggage claim area, where a steady stream of suitcases circled on the conveyor belts. Jack scanned the space, but there were still no signs of a green coat or a brown bag. The longer they searched, the more the doubt crept in. He could see it in Peter's face too, his eyes darting frantically from one person to another, searching for a hint of familiarity. Peter, Jack said gently, are you sure your mom was right at the security area when you last saw her? Peter hesitated, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. I think so, but there were a lot of people. I just lost her. Jack nodded slowly, understanding the panic the boy must have felt. Okay, let's not worry about that right now. We'll keep looking. But deep down, a part of him was starting to question if they were really just looking for a lost mom, or if there was something else going on. There was a sinking feeling in his gut that he couldn't quite shake off. He wasn't sure what it was yet, but it left him uneasy. As they turned to leave the baggage claim area, Jack placed a reassuring hand on Peter's shoulder. Let's try the information desk. Maybe someone saw her. Peter nodded, and they began to walk again, moving deeper into the labyrinth of the airport. Jack wasn't sure what he was hoping to find, but he knew they couldn't stop searching, not yet. As Jack and Peter made their way toward the information desk, the airport buzzed around them, a never-ending sea of hurried footsteps and the low murmur of announcements echoing overhead. Peter stayed close to Jack, his small hand gripping the suitcase handle tightly. Jack's eyes scanned every face in the crowd, hoping to catch a glimpse of a woman in a green coat, but his mind was elsewhere, drifting in and out of the past. Moments of his own life played back in his head like a disjointed reel. He saw himself sitting at his office desk, surrounded by piles of paperwork and unanswered emails. He remembered the persistent knot of tension in his stomach as his boss reminded him yet again about missed deadlines. The final straw had been the meeting he'd walked out of just days ago, unable to handle the mounting pressure. Then came the argument with his ex-wife, her accusing tone still echoed in his ears. You're never here, Jack. Even when you are, it's like you're somewhere else. The recollections seemed to blend together, forming a suffocating mass that made it hard to breathe. He had come to the airport not because he was traveling somewhere, but because he needed to escape, to get away from everything that was falling apart. And here he was, caught up in someone else's crisis. Jack shook the thoughts away as they approached the information desk. An older woman with a kind face looked up from behind the counter as they arrived. Hi, we're looking for this boy's mom, Jack said, gesturing toward Peter. She's wearing a green coat and carrying a brown bag. The last place he saw her was near the security area. The woman gave Peter a sympathetic smile before turning her attention to the computer screen. Let me check if anyone matching that description has been reported or left any messages, she said, her fingers tapping swiftly on the keyboard. Peter glanced up at Jack, his expression a mixture of hope and fear. What if she's not here? He whispered, his voice barely audible. Jack hesitated. It was a question he hadn't allowed himself to consider. She has to be, kid, he said, but the reassurance sounded hollow even to his own ears. He wasn't sure if he was saying it for Peter's benefit or his own. The woman at the desk looked up, her brow furrowing slightly. I'm sorry, but I don't see any reports of a missing child matching this description, nor has anyone fitting that description left a message. She paused, as if weighing her words. You might want to check with airport security again, or even the lost and found, just in case. Jack nodded stiffly, muttering a quick thanks as they turned away from the desk. Peter's face was pale, his lower lip trembling slightly. Jack could see the boy was holding back tears, and a pang of guilt hit him, guilt for not having more answers, for not knowing how to navigate this situation better. As they walked, Jack tried to distract the boy with conversation. So, Peter, do you travel a lot? He asked, keeping his tone light. Peter shrugged. Sometimes. Mostly with my mom. We were visiting my grandma before this. He didn't offer any more details, and Jack didn't press. There was something about the boy's manner, something that didn't quite add up. It was almost as if he was used to being on his own, more than a child his age should be. Jack's thoughts flickered back to his own childhood. His father had left when he was young, leaving Jack's mother to work 2 jobs just to keep them afloat. He remembered spending long hours after school by himself, filling the silence with books and imaginary friends. The loneliness had become a constant companion, one he'd carried into adulthood without even realizing it. As they reached the lost and found area, Jack's doubts grew. What if Peter's situation was more complicated than just being a lost child? There were too many inconsistencies, too many unanswered questions that didn't sit right. The attendant at the lost and found greeted them with a practiced smile. How can I help you today? We're still looking for his mom, Jack explained, trying not to sound as desperate as he felt. Green coat, brown bag. Haven't seen her since they got separated near security. The attendant shook his head slowly. I'm afraid I haven't seen anyone like that. You might want to leave a description here, just in case she comes by. Jack filled out a brief form while Peter stood quietly by his side. As he handed the paper back to the attendant, Jack noticed the boy's shoulders slump, his small figure looking even more fragile than before. Jack knelt down beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Hey, don't give up yet, okay? We're going to find her. He hoped his words could reach through the uncertainty clouding both their minds. But deep down, he wondered if they were running out of places to look. Jack and Peter wandered the airport halls, the crowd shifting and bustling around them like a living, breathing entity. Jack's thoughts grew heavier with each passing minute. The more they searched, the more it felt like they were chasing a shadow. There was still no sign of a woman in a green coat, and the vague unease that had started to gnaw at him earlier was now turning into a distinct sense of dread. They reached an open area near the central terminal where a few security guards stood chatting. Jack approached one of them, a tall man with a mustache, hoping to find a clue, or at least some reassurance. Excuse me, Jack said, keeping his voice steady, we've been looking for this boy's mother for a while now. She's wearing a green coat and has a brown bag. Any chance you've seen her, or heard anything? The guard's eyes shifted toward Peter, who stood there looking small and vulnerable. He frowned, shaking his head slowly. I haven't seen anyone like that, but I can check in with the rest of the team, he said, reaching for his radio. We'll keep an eye out. Peter's face remained impassive, but Jack could feel the boy's grip tightening on his suitcase handle. There was a quiet resignation about him that seemed out of place for a child this age, as though this wasn't the first time he had been left waiting. Let's sit over there, Jack suggested, motioning to a small seating area nearby. He and Peter took a seat on the edge of a fountain, its steady trickling sound somehow adding to the surreal nature of the situation. Jack leaned in, lowering his voice. Peter, I need you to be honest with me. Are you sure your mom was here at the airport with you today? Peter glanced up at Jack, his eyes wide. Yes. I think so. His voice wavered. We were together this morning, at the hotel. Then we came here. Jack's brow furrowed. Did you check in together? Did she come through security with you? Peter shook his head. No. She said she had to take care of something and that I should wait. But then, I didn't see her again. His voice grew small, barely above a whisper. The revelation hit Jack like a blow to the chest. He had been assuming all along that Peter's mother was frantically searching for her child, but what if she had left him behind intentionally? The thought felt too harsh to voice, and yet it was the only explanation that made sense. Jack's gaze drifted back to the boy, who was staring down at the tiled floor. Before he could press further, a woman wearing a blue uniform approached them. She was one of the airport's security staff, and her name tag read Karen. Hi there, she said, her tone soft and kind. I heard from one of the guards that you're looking for a missing person? Yeah, Jack replied, standing up to meet her gaze. We've been trying to find this boy's mother. She's wearing a green coat and carrying a brown bag. Last time he saw her was, well, actually, we're not so sure anymore. He glanced at Peter, then back at Karen. It's possible she hasn't been here for a while. Karen's eyes softened as she looked down at Peter. Sweetheart, have you been traveling alone? She asked gently. Peter's eyes darted to Jack, as if seeking his permission to answer. I don't know, he murmured. She said she was coming back. The words hung in the air like a thin mist, barely solid enough to grasp. Jack watched Karen's expression shift slightly, sympathy mixed with a hint of suspicion. She crouched down to Peter's level. Can you remember the last time you saw your mom, honey? She asked. Peter hesitated, his eyes glistening. It was before we got to the airport. She said she'd be right back. Karen glanced up at Jack, her expression tightening. I think it's best if we get the authorities involved, she said, her tone cautious but firm. If she's been missing for this long, we need to find out what's really going on. Jack swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him even more. He nodded slowly. Yeah, I guess that's the right thing to do. Peter's face fell. No, he said quickly, his voice trembling. Please, don't call the police. I don't want to cause trouble. Jack turned to the boy, his heart sinking at the sight of Peter's frightened expression. Peter, we just want to make sure you're safe, that's all. The boy shook his head furiously. I don't need the police, he said, his voice barely holding steady. Just, don't let them take me away. The desperation in Peter's tone sent a chill through Jack. He didn't know what had happened before they met, but it was clear that Peter was terrified of whatever might come next. Jack glanced at Karen, who seemed ready to call in further help. For some reason, he found himself wanting to respect Peter's wishes, at least for now. Let's hold off on that for a bit, Jack said, surprising himself. Give us a little more time to figure things out. Please. Karen hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. All right, she said. But don't wait too long, okay? Jack thanked her, then turned back to Peter, his mind racing. Whatever they were dealing with, it was more than just a lost child, and it was up to him to find out the truth. Jack led Peter away from the security area, his mind swirling with unanswered questions. As they walked, he noticed a small cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of the terminal. It seemed like a good place to take a break and regroup. They settled at a table near the window, where the steady hum of the airport felt slightly more distant, as though they had found a brief sanctuary from the chaos outside. Are you hungry? Jack asked, trying to keep his tone light. He had no idea how long Peter had been wandering the airport or if he had eaten anything since that morning. Peter shook his head but didn't speak. He was staring out the window, where planes taxied along the runways, carrying passengers to destinations far away. Jack followed his gaze and wondered if the boy was thinking about his own journey, wherever it was supposed to be taking him. Hey, Jack said, leaning in slightly. I know this is hard, but I need you to be straight with me. Did your mom leave you here on purpose? Peter's head snapped around, his eyes widening. No, he said quickly, his voice rising with a note of panic. She didn't leave me. She just had to do something. She said she'd be back. Jack studied Peter's face, looking for any sign that the boy was lying. But all he saw was a child struggling to hold onto a story that might not even make sense to him. It was as though Peter himself wasn't sure what was true and what wasn't. Jack let out a slow breath and rubbed his forehead. This wasn't getting any clearer, and now he had to decide what to do next. The waitress came by, and Jack ordered a coffee for himself and a hot chocolate for Peter, figuring the boy could use something warm to drink. As they waited, Peter finally broke the silence. My mom and I move around a lot, he said softly, his gaze drifting back to the window. She works different jobs in different places. Sometimes we stay with people for a little while, but then we have to go somewhere else. He took a shaky breath. But she always comes back for me. Jack's stomach tightened. He hadn't realized how complicated Peter's life was, how accustomed he seemed to being shuffled from place to place. There was a weariness in his voice that didn't belong to a child his age, a kind of acceptance that this was just how things were. What about your dad? Jack asked, trying to fill in the blanks. Is he around? Peter shook his head. I don't know him. It's just me and my mom. He paused, then added in a quieter voice, and sometimes it's just me. The waitress returned with their drinks, and they lapsed into a silence filled only by the occasional clink of the cups on the table. Jack sipped his coffee, trying to wrap his mind around the situation. The more he learned, the more tangled everything became. If Peter's mother really had left him here, it wouldn't be the first time he'd been left alone, but something still didn't add up. Why leave a young boy in a crowded airport without any kind of plan? Listen, Peter, Jack said finally, setting his cup down. If your mom doesn't come back soon, we need to figure out where you can stay. Maybe there's another relative we can contact? Peter's eyes darted up, a flicker of resistance in them. No, he said, shaking his head. I don't want to stay with anyone else. I just want to wait for her. Jack frowned, not sure how to handle the boy's insistence. It was clear Peter was afraid, maybe not just of being alone, but of something else entirely. Jack glanced at his phone, tempted to call the authorities again. But there was something about the boy's desperation that made him hesitate. The look in his eyes was painfully familiar, like looking into a mirror of his own past. Jack thought back to his own childhood, the way he used to cling to the idea that his father might come back someday, even though deep down he knew better. He saw that same hope flickering in Peter now, and he wasn't sure if he had the heart to extinguish it just yet. Okay, Jack said slowly, but we can't just sit here forever. If your mom doesn't show up soon, we need a plan. There's a place I can call that helps kids when they get separated from their parents. They might be able to find her faster than we can. Peter looked up, his eyes filled with uncertainty. Will they take me away? Jack's chest tightened. No, he lied, hoping it was true. They're just here to help. But I'll stay with you until we find her, okay? The boy's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he gave a hesitant nod. Okay, he said. Jack leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the promise he had just made. He didn't know how long he could keep it, but for now, he was all Peter had. As they finished their drinks, Jack tried to shake off the nagging feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than either of them expected. The afternoon sun was starting to dip beyond the airport windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Jack glanced at Peter, who was now staring down at his half-empty cup of hot chocolate. He'd have to make some decisions soon, and whatever they did next, it would need to be more than just waiting. As the hours wore on, the airport seemed to grow quieter, the bustle of the day giving way to a more subdued atmosphere. Jack and Peter wandered back toward the main terminal, passing through a corridor lined with shops that were beginning to close for the night. Jack could feel the weight of fatigue settling in, but he kept moving, knowing that stopping meant facing the reality that Peter's mother might never return. They reached the administration office, a glass-fronted room where a lone clerk sat behind the counter. Jack hesitated for a moment, then decided to try one more time. It was their last shot before calling in the authorities. Hi, Jack said, his voice sounding more tired than he intended. We've been looking for this boy's mother all day. She's wearing a green coat, carrying a brown bag. The last time he saw her was before they reached the airport. Is there any chance you have information, or maybe a message left for him? The clerk, a middle-aged woman with short gray hair, peered down at Peter with a kind, if weary, expression. Let's see what I can find, she said, typing quickly on her computer. After a few moments, she glanced back up, her brow furrowed. We don't have any reports matching that description, but wait. She reached for a piece of paper beside the keyboard. There was a note left here earlier this afternoon. It was addressed to whoever finds Peter. Is that his name? Jack's stomach dropped. Yes, he answered slowly, his eyes shifting to Peter, who was listening intently. The clerk handed him the folded piece of paper. I didn't know if it was serious, but it seemed like it might be important, she said quietly. Jack took the note, hesitating before opening it. The words on the page were written in a hurried scrawl, underscored to whoever finds Peter. I'm sorry, but I can't do this anymore. I don't have the means to take care of him, and I hope someone kind will look after him. Please don't try to find me. He deserves better than I can give. Underscore Jack stared at the note, feeling a mix of shock and anger welling up inside him. He read the words over again, hoping that somehow he had misunderstood, that it couldn't be as simple and cruel as it seemed. But the reality was undeniable. Peter's mother had abandoned him here, with nothing but a hastily written plea for help left behind. Peter tugged at Jack's sleeve. What does it say? He asked, his voice quiet but edged with anxiety. Jack knelt down to Peter's level, folding the note and slipping it into his pocket. It's from your mom, he said, carefully choosing his words. She's not here, Peter. She had to leave, and she didn't think she could take care of you anymore. Peter's eyes widened, filling with a mixture of disbelief and fear. No, he whispered, shaking his head. She wouldn't do that. She said she'd come back. Jack felt his chest tighten as he watched Peter struggle to process what he had just learned. I'm so sorry, he said softly. I know this is hard, but you're not alone, okay? I'm here. Peter's expression shifted from shock to anger. Why did she leave me? He cried, his voice rising. Why doesn't she want me? The clerk behind the counter glanced at them, her face etched with sympathy. Jack reached out and put a hand on Peter's shoulder, trying to steady him. I don't know why, Peter, he admitted, feeling the inadequacy of his own words. But it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. Sometimes grown-ups make bad decisions because they're scared or don't know what to do. Peter's shoulders trembled, and he took a step back, his gaze fixed on the floor. I don't want to go to a foster home, he whispered. Please, Jack, don't let them take me away. The desperation in Peter's voice struck a chord deep within Jack, stirring up feelings he had long buried. He had experienced abandonment himself as a child, the feeling of being unwanted, and he couldn't shake the thought that Peter was now facing that same cruel reality. For reasons Jack couldn't fully explain, he knew he couldn't just hand the boy over to the system and walk away. All right, Jack said, his voice firmer now. We'll figure something out, but we can't stay here much longer. We need to come up with a plan. Peter nodded, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. Can I stay with you? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jack hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. He wasn't prepared to be responsible for a child, especially not in his current state. But as he looked at Peter, a boy whose life had just been turned upside down, he couldn't bring himself to say no. For tonight, at least, Jack said finally, we'll find a hotel nearby. Tomorrow, we'll figure out our next steps. Peter's eyes brightened, just a little, and he nodded. Thank you, he murmured. As they left the administration office, Jack felt the enormity of what he had just agreed to settling in. He had promised to help a boy who had nowhere else to turn, and he wasn't sure if he was capable of keeping that promise. But as they stepped into the fading light of the terminal, Jack knew he had to try. Together, they walked toward the exit, leaving behind the last remnants of hope that Peter's mother might come back. Now, it was just the two of them, facing an uncertain future. The night air outside the airport was cool, and the sky had settled into a deep blue. Jack and Peter stood by the curb, waiting for a taxi. The enormity of what lay ahead pressed on Jack's chest like a weight, but for now, the only thing he could focus on was getting Peter somewhere safe for the night. The cab pulled up, and they climbed in. Jack gave the driver the address of a nearby hotel he had spotted earlier. As they drove, Peter stared out the window, silent and withdrawn. His small frame seemed to sink further into the seat with every mile, as though he were trying to disappear. The hotel wasn't much, just a budget place off the highway, but it was clean and relatively quiet. Jack checked in at the front desk, the clerk barely glancing up from his computer as he slid over the room key. Once inside, Jack dropped his bag on the floor and glanced around the modest space. 2 single beds, a small TV, and a bathroom with a flickering light. It would have to do. You can take that bed, Jack said, nodding toward the one closest to the window. Peter nodded silently and sat on the edge of the bed, still clutching his small suitcase as though it were a life preserver. Jack watched him for a moment, unsure of what to say. The boy hadn't spoken since they left the airport, and Jack wasn't sure if he was giving Peter the space he needed or if he should be doing something more. He took a seat on his own bed and exhaled, rubbing his tired eyes. So, do you want to talk about it? Jack asked gently, trying to break the silence. About your mom, I mean. Peter shook his head, his gaze fixed on the floor. I just don't understand why she left, he whispered. We were fine. I thought we were fine. Jack's heart clenched at the raw hurt in the boy's voice. He had no answers to give, nothing that could take away that pain. Sometimes people do things that don't make sense, he said quietly. It doesn't mean it was your fault. Peter's eyes flickered with a mix of sadness and doubt. But what if she never comes back? His voice cracked as he spoke. What if I'm all alone? You're not alone, Jack replied, more firmly than he intended. I know it feels like it right now, but I'm here, and I'm not going to leave you. Peter's gaze met Jack's, as if searching for some truth in his words. Slowly, he nodded and finally set his suitcase down beside the bed. Okay, he murmured. Jack forced a small smile, then rose from the bed and moved toward the small table near the window. How about we order some food, he suggested. I don't know about you, but I haven't eaten much today. Peter shrugged. I'm not really hungry. Come on, Jack said, picking up the room service menu and glancing through it. You can't say no to pizza. Or a burger. He kept his tone light, hoping to draw the boy out of his shell a little. After a moment, Peter gave a small nod. I guess a burger's okay, he said quietly. Jack ordered dinner, and as they waited for the food to arrive, he couldn't help but wonder how he was going to handle this situation. He had promised to help Peter, but what did that really mean? Tomorrow, they would need a plan. They couldn't just keep wandering around without a clear idea of what to do next. While they ate, Jack tried to steer the conversation to safer ground, asking Peter about his favorite movies and games. The boy responded in short answers at first, but gradually, he began to open up, his tone less guarded. By the time they finished eating, Peter was talking about a superhero movie he had seen recently, his eyes lighting up for the first time since the airport. As the night wore on, the reality of what awaited them the next day loomed larger in Jack's mind. They would need to make a decision about contacting the authorities or finding some way to track down any family members. He thought back to the note Peter's mother had left and the vague mention of other places they had stayed before. There had to be someone who could take the boy in, someone better equipped to care for him than a man who could barely manage his own life. Peter yawned and rubbed his eyes, the exhaustion finally catching up with him. "You should get some sleep," Jack said. "Tomorrow's going to be a busy day." Peter nodded and crawled under the covers, pulling them up to his chin. "Good night, Jack," he murmured. "Good night, Peter," Jack replied softly. He watched as the boy drifted off, his breathing growing slow and steady. It struck Jack how small Peter seemed lying there, just a kid who had been left behind in a world that could be so cold and indifferent. Jack lay back on his own bed, staring up at the ceiling, the events of the day replaying in his mind. He didn't know why he had taken on the responsibility of this boy or where it would lead them, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. Whatever happened next, he was committed to seeing it through. He had made a promise, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, it felt like the most important thing he had done in a long time. As the room grew quiet and the lights dimmed, Jack closed his eyes, trying to push away the thoughts of his own life that had been falling apart. For tonight, at least, he had a purpose. And as much as he had stumbled into it, he couldn't let it go. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, filling the room with a pale, hesitant glow. Jack woke up stiff and sore, his back protesting the uncomfortable mattress. He glanced over at Peter, who was still asleep, curled up under the covers with his small suitcase beside him. For a brief moment, Jack allowed himself to hope that they could delay the inevitable a little longer, but he knew better. Today, they had to face reality. Jack let Peter sleep a bit more while he got ready. As he sipped the weak hotel coffee, he thought through their options. The note left by Peter's mother hadn't given them much to go on, but maybe they could track down some other family members. It was the only viable plan he had, short of involving the authorities immediately. After Peter woke up and dressed, they headed downstairs to the lobby. Jack had found a payphone near the front desk and dialed the number for the hotel where Peter and his mother had stayed the night before. He hoped there might be some information that could help them, an emergency contact, a forwarding address, anything. The woman at the other end of the line was polite but firm. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't give out that kind of information," she said. "We don't have a forwarding address or emergency contact listed." Jack's shoulders sagged. "Thanks anyway," he muttered, hanging up the phone. He could feel Peter's eyes on him, silently waiting for an answer he didn't have. "Any luck?" Peter asked, his voice tinged with a hope that Jack didn't want to extinguish. "Not much," Jack admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But I think we should try looking for any other family members. Do you know if your mom has any siblings, or if there's anyone we could call?" Peter hesitated, his brow furrowing as he thought. "There's my aunt," he said finally. "She lives in a different city, but I don't know if she'd want to take me in. We haven't seen her in a long time." Jack's interest piqued. "Do you know her name? Maybe we could try to reach out." "Her name is Sarah," Peter said, though he didn't sound very confident. "She's my mom's sister, but they don't talk much. I only met her once, a few years ago. It wasn't much, but it was something." Jack felt a small flicker of relief as he pulled out his phone to search for any listings under the name Sarah that matched the area where Peter's aunt supposedly lived. After a few minutes of scrolling, he found a number that looked like it could be a match. He dialed it, not knowing what to expect. The phone rang several times before a voice finally answered. "Hello?" The woman sounded cautious, as if she didn't recognize the number. "Hi, is this Sarah?" Jack asked, trying to keep his tone steady. "I'm sorry to call you out of the blue, but I'm with your nephew, Peter. We're trying to find someone who can help take care of him." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Peter?" Sarah's voice wavered slightly. Why is he with you? Where's Emma?" Jack took a deep breath, steeling himself for the explanation. "I'm afraid Emma left Peter at the airport," he said, his words careful. "She left a note saying she couldn't take care of him anymore." Sarah's intake of breath was audible, a sharp, stunned gasp. "She left him," she repeated, as though struggling to comprehend the situation. "I can't believe this. But I haven't spoken to Emma in years." Jack could hear the hesitation in her voice, and he knew what was coming. "Look," he said, "I know this is asking a lot, but Peter needs someone right now. I don't know what else to do." "I'm sorry," Sarah replied, her tone softening. "I wish I could help, but I'm not in a position to take care of a child. I'm barely getting by myself." Jack's stomach sank. Are you sure? He pressed, though he knew it was no use. He really doesn't have anywhere else to go. I'm sorry, she repeated, sounding genuinely regretful. I just can't. Jack hung up, his hand trembling slightly as he put the phone back in his pocket. He could feel Peter's expectant gaze on him, and he forced himself to meet the boy's eyes. She can't help us, Jack said, hating how empty the words sounded. But we'll find another way. I promise. Peter's face fell, his small shoulders slumping with disappointment. So, what do we do now? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jack wished he had a clear answer, but all he could think to do was keep moving forward. We'll figure it out, he said, though he was saying it as much for himself as for Peter. Come on. Let's get some breakfast, and then we'll start making some calls. As they sat down in the small hotel cafe, Jack's mind raced with potential options. He could try contacting child services, but that still felt like giving up. There had to be some way to keep Peter out of the system, some alternative that didn't involve the cold indifference of bureaucracy. Peter poked at his food, clearly lost in thought. Jack, he said suddenly, his voice hesitant, what if you took care of me? Jack froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. Peter, I'm not sure that's a good idea, he replied, trying to find the right words. I'm not really equipped to take care of a kid. Peter's eyes met his, filled with a quiet desperation. I know, he said, but I don't want to go anywhere else. You're the only one who's tried to help me. Jack swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Peter's words settle deep in his chest. He had promised to help, but becoming Peter's guardian was something he hadn't even considered. Yet, as he looked at the boy sitting across from him, he knew that the idea wasn't as impossible as it seemed. Let's take this one step at a time, Jack said softly. We still have some other options to explore. But, if it comes to that, we'll figure something out. I'm not going to let you down. Peter's expression softened, and he gave a small nod. It wasn't a promise that Jack could make lightly, but for now, it was enough to keep them moving forward. Jack and Peter spent the day making phone calls, each one feeling more futile than the last. The distant voices on the other end were sympathetic but unhelpful, relatives who hadn't spoken to Emma in years, family friends who didn't have the means to step in, and social services representatives who suggested calling the authorities as soon as possible. The circle of possibilities was tightening, and Jack could feel Peter's hope shrinking with each failed attempt. By mid-afternoon, they were both exhausted. They returned to the hotel room, where Peter sat on the bed, staring silently at the wall. Jack stood by the window, phone in hand, trying to muster the courage to make the call he had been avoiding all day. He knew it was only a matter of time before child services became involved, but he also knew that once they took over, Peter would likely end up in a foster home. The thought of the boy being shuffled from place to place, never finding a real home, gnawed at Jack. It was a path Jack himself had come close to as a child, when his mother struggled to keep them afloat. He couldn't shake the feeling that handing Peter over would be abandoning him all over again. Peter's voice broke the silence. Are you calling them? He asked, his tone edged with dread. Jack turned around, seeing the fear etched on Peter's face. No, he said, dropping the phone onto the bedside table. Not yet. Peter looked relieved, but didn't say anything. Jack knew they couldn't keep delaying the inevitable. Even if he wanted to help Peter, he wasn't sure how to go about it. His own life was a mess, and taking on a child, especially under these circumstances, seemed reckless. But as he glanced at the boy, his heart softened. There had to be another way. The thought struck him suddenly. They could go and meet Sarah, Peter's aunt, in person. Maybe if she saw the boy standing in front of her, it would change her mind. It was a long shot, but it was better than doing nothing. Peter, Jack began cautiously, what if we took a trip to see your Aunt Sarah? I know she said she can't help over the phone, but maybe if we talk to her face to face, she'll change her mind. Peter's eyes lit up, a glimmer of hope returning to his expression. You think she might? He asked. It's worth a try, Jack replied. We don't have many other options right now. Within an hour, Jack had booked a rental car and checked them out of the hotel. The drive would take several hours, but it was the only lead they had. As they headed out of the city, Peter sat quietly in the passenger seat, his small figure dwarfed by the seatbelt. The landscape blurred by in shades of green and gray as the car sped along the highway. The long drive gave Jack too much time to think, and he found his thoughts drifting back to the past. His father had walked out when Jack was about Peter's age, leaving his mother to pick up the pieces. She had worked tirelessly to provide for him, but the absence of a father had left a wound that never fully healed. Jack had promised himself that if he ever had children, he would be there for them no matter what. And now, here he was, considering taking in a boy who wasn't even his. By the time they arrived at Sarah's address, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the small, run-down house. Jack pulled the car into the gravel driveway and cut the engine. Peter stared at the house, his expression a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. "Let's go see if she's home," Jack said, his voice calm despite the apprehension stirring inside him. They walked up to the front door, and Jack gave a firm knock. For a moment, there was no response, and Jack began to wonder if they had come all this way for nothing. But then the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 30s, her features worn and tired. She looked at Jack with confusion, then her eyes fell on Peter, and her expression softened. "Peter?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Hi, Aunt Sarah," Peter said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's eyes darted from Peter to Jack, clearly struggling to understand the situation. What are you doing here?" she asked, a mix of concern and disbelief in her tone. Jack stepped forward. "I'm sorry to show up unannounced," he said, "but we really didn't know what else to do." Peter's mother, Emma, left him at the airport. "We've been trying to find someone who can help take care of him." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening. "She left him," she echoed, her voice heavy with shock. "What happened to her?" "She left a note," Jack said, his voice tight. "Said she couldn't take care of him anymore." Sarah's face twisted with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "That sounds like Emma," she muttered, shaking her head. "She always was a runner, couldn't face anything." Her gaze returned to Peter, who was watching her with silent hope. "I'm so sorry, Peter. I didn't know." "Please," Peter said, taking a small step forward. "Can I stay with you? Just for a little while?" Sarah's expression softened, but Jack could see the hesitation behind her eyes. She was clearly overwhelmed, and though she cared for Peter, it was obvious she hadn't expected to take on the responsibility of raising him. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I wish I could, but I'm not in a good place to." "Please," Peter repeated, his voice more urgent now. "I don't want to go anywhere else." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Jack could see Sarah wavering, her heart struggling with the reality of her circumstances. He stepped forward again, his voice low but firm. "I know this is a lot to ask," he said, "but Peter needs someone he can count on, and I think he needs family right now." Sarah looked at Jack, then back at Peter. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "Okay," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can stay, at least for a little while. We'll figure it out from there." Peter's face lit up, and he rushed forward to hug Sarah. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly. Jack stood back, letting the relief wash over him. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. As he watched Sarah and Peter, Jack felt something lift inside him, a sense that, for the first time in a long while, he had made a real difference. Sarah's small house was far from ideal, but for Peter, it felt like a new beginning. The cramped living room was cluttered with boxes and old furniture, a sign that Sarah was still in the process of settling in. It was clear she hadn't expected company, let alone a young boy who had just lost his mother. But despite the modest surroundings, there was a warmth in Sarah's embrace as she held Peter close, reassuring him in a way only family could. Jack stood by the doorway, watching the quiet reunion unfold. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was more than they had that morning, and it gave Peter a place to start again. Sarah released Peter from the hug and looked over at Jack, her expression a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "Thank you for bringing him here," she said, her voice soft. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Jack gave a small nod. "I'm just glad we found someone who could take him in," he replied. "I know this isn't what you planned, but I think he's going to be okay here. With you." Sarah's gaze drifted to Peter, who was now examining a worn-out photo album on the coffee table. "I'll do my best," she said, almost to herself. I didn't know Emma had reached this point. If I had known." She shook her head, her voice trailing off. "We can't change what happened," Jack said gently, "but at least now he's with someone who cares about him. That's more than most kids get in situations like this." Sarah offered a faint, tired smile. "I suppose you're right." She took a step toward Jack, her expression growing more serious. "But what about you? You've done so much for Peter. I'm sure this whole thing wasn't easy for you either." Jack shrugged, the weight of the past few days settling into his bones. "Honestly, I don't know what I was doing half the time," he admitted. I couldn't walk away from him. He deserved better than being left alone." For a moment, the room fell silent. Jack felt a strange sense of finality washing over him. It was time to go, to let Peter start this new chapter without him. But as he moved toward the door, Peter's voice stopped him. "Are you leaving?" Peter asked, his small voice breaking the stillness. Jack turned, and the look on Peter's face made his heart sink. There was that same vulnerability in the boy's eyes, the same fear of being abandoned again. Jack felt a lump form in his throat. "I think it's time for you to stay here with your aunt," he said gently. "This is where you belong, Peter." Peter hesitated, then took a step toward Jack, his expression uncertain. "Will I ever see you again?" Jack knelt down so he was at eye level with the boy. "I'm not going to disappear, okay?" he said, his voice steady. "I'll keep in touch, and I'll visit whenever I can. You're not alone, Peter. Not anymore." Peter nodded, though his eyes glistened with unshed tears. He took a deep breath, as though steeling himself against the emotions swirling inside. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not giving up on me." Jack's chest tightened as he reached out to ruffle Peter's hair. "You're a tough kid," he said. "You're going to be okay." He glanced over at Sarah, who gave him a reassuring nod. Jack could see she was ready to take on this new responsibility, to give Peter the stability he needed. He stood up, pulling a business card from his pocket and handing it to Sarah. "If you need anything at all, just call me," he said. "I'll be around." Sarah took the card, her eyes meeting his with a sincerity that spoke of quiet resolve. "I will. And thank you, Jack, for everything." Jack gave one last look at Peter, who was now sitting on the couch, flipping through the old photo album with cautious curiosity. He was in good hands. With a final nod, Jack turned and walked out the door, the cool evening air hitting him as he stepped outside. As he got back into the rental car, Jack felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. He had done what he set out to do, given Peter a chance at something better. But as he drove away from Sarah's house, the quiet hum of the road seemed to echo with the uncertainty of his own future. He realized that in helping Peter, he had found something he hadn't known he was searching for, a sense of purpose. In those moments of crisis, he had been forced to confront not just Peter's fears, but his own. He had faced the loneliness and loss that had defined so much of his life, and in doing so, he had found a way to move forward. The road stretched out before him, bathed in the fading light of the sunset. Jack didn't know exactly where it would lead, but for the first time in a long while, he was ready to find out. As he drove away, he felt a sense of quiet determination settle within him. Maybe he wasn't completely lost after all.